The registry hall at Ellis Island held approximately 5,000 people on its busiest days. The main building opened in 1900, replacing a wooden structure that had burned to the ground in 1897, and in the first full decade of the 20th century, it processed more than 8 million arrivals. Italians and Poles, and Ashkenazi Jews and Greeks, and Slavs and Russians, and Ukrainians, and Hungarians and Germans arrived carrying surnames that had been in their families for generations. Some surnames traced back to medieval guild records. Some had been assigned by Napoleon's administrators when he decreed that everyone across his territories would carry a hereditary family name. Some had been carried all the way from shtetls in the Pale of Settlement to the port at Hamburg, from villages in Calabria to the docks at Naples, from market towns in Galicia to whatever ship was leaving first for America. Some of those families had held their names for 3 and 4 generations before they sailed. Some were carrying names their grandparents had only recently received. Those names did not always make it across intact. The moment of arrival that the Ellis Island photographs record, the long line moving through the main hall, the medical inspection, the legal inspection, the table where the clerk wrote down the name, was not the moment the family became American. It was the moment the family's name entered the American record for the first time. What happened to that name over the following decade, in school enrollment offices and naturalization courts, and employer payroll books and census taker notebooks, is what the official record does not always show. What the ship manifests from the Ellis Island era do show is a record of the moment before the translation began. The lists were compiled from passenger documents assembled at the port of departure. Inspectors aboard the ships checked names against those lists as passengers disembarked. The name that went into the registry at Ellis Island was often already a changed version of the name the passenger had carried in the country of origin. And the name that appeared in the first American census record, the first school enrollment, the first baptismal certificate on the American side, was sometimes different again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 12 million people passed through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1954. The years of heaviest traffic ran from 1892 to 1924, when the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act imposed national origin quotas that effectively ended the mass migration era. By the time those gates narrowed, surnames from more than 100 ethnic and linguistic traditions had been absorbed into the American record under English-sounding forms that their original holders would sometimes barely recognize. The process was not a single event at the inspection desk. Immigration officers at Ellis Island have been blamed, in family memory and in popular history alike, for changing surnames on the spot, writing down whatever they thought they heard, and sending the immigrant into America under a new name. The ship manifests, which are searchable today through the Ellis Island Foundation database and through Ancestry and Family Search, tell a different story. The name entered at Ellis Island was almost always taken directly from the ship's passenger list. That list was compiled at the port of departure, usually Hamburg or Bremen or Liverpool or Naples or Antwerp, by the shipping company's clerks. If a name was changed in that process, it happened before the ship left Europe. If the inspector at Ellis Island wrote something slightly different from what appears on the manifest, it was usually a clerical variation, not a deliberate renaming. What the ship manifests cannot tell you is what happened in the months and years after the family walked out of the registry hall and into the streets beyond it. That is where the names changed. That is where the bloodlines began their silence. Stone. In the federal census of 1900, more than 50,000 households in the United States reported the surname Stone. Genealogical databases trace Stone to Old English, to the topographic name given to someone who lived near a notable stone or stony ground. That is true for a portion of the Stone families in the American record. It is not the whole story. Stein in German and in Yiddish means stone. The Jewish immigrant families who arrived through Ellis Island from Austria-Hungary, from the Russian Empire, from Romania and Germany between 1880 and 1924 included large numbers of families named Stein, Steinberg, Steinfeld, Steinmann, and Steiner. Within one generation of arrival, a substantial share of those families had become Stone in the American census. The genealogical logic was practical. Stein was identifiable to an English speaker in an American city in 1910 in a way that Stone was not. The name that looked English, sounded English, and filed paperwork in English became the name that survived. What the 1910 census shows for families who made this transition is a household listed as Stone in which the parents' places of birth are recorded as Russia or Austria, the children were born in New York or Pennsylvania or Illinois, and the father's first language, when recorded at all, was Yiddish. That is the census fingerprint of a Stein to Stone transition, a bloodline present in the record, visible if you know what to look at, invisible if you assume that Stone means English, black. The same translation applies to Schwartz. In German and in Yiddish, the word for black is Schwartz or Schwartz, and Schwartz was a common surname across the Ashkenazi communities of Central and Eastern Europe. The Schwartz families who arrived in America faced a surname immediately identifiable as German Jewish in origin. In the decades after the First World War, when anti-German sentiment in the United States ran high enough that American families named Schmidt had already begun changing to Smith, and German-American organizations stopped publishing their newspapers and holding their events, a German-sounding surname carried social costs that families weighed against the cost of changing it. The Schwartz families who became black in American records were making the same calculation that hundreds of thousands of immigrant families made across 2 generations. The name that announced what you were could be replaced by the name that concealed it. The genealogical trace for Schwartz to black transitions is visible in naturalization records. Naturalization before 1941 required 2 court appearances separated by at least 2 years, the declaration of intent and the petition for naturalization itself. Many petitions contain name change requests as part of the process. A petition that shows a family named Schwartz becoming black in 1923 in a county court in New Jersey or Ohio is the document that connects the European surname to the American one. Those petitions are searchable. Many have been digitized. White. Weiss means white in German and in Yiddish, and it was among the most common Ashkenazi Jewish surnames. White, in the American census, is predominantly English in origin, from the Old English wheat, applied to someone with fair hair or a pale complexion. But in the decades between 1900 and 1940, Weiss appears in naturalization records and in petition files across New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, being entered as white. The translation is exact, not approximate. A family named Weiss did not choose white because it sounded vaguely similar. They chose it because it meant the same thing in English as Weiss meant in German and Yiddish, the name that the family had carried since the surname assignment edicts of the 18th and early 19th centuries crossed the Atlantic and then, within a generation, crossed into English. The genealogical record holds both forms, if you know to look for both. Müller. Müller is the German word for miller, the person who operates a grain mill. It is the most common surname in Germany today, and was among the most common in the German-speaking world of the 18th and 19th centuries. The German and German Jewish communities that arrived in the United States in 2 distinct waves, the first in the 1840s and 1850s, the second from the 1870s through to the Quota Act of 1924, included large numbers of Müller families. The transition to Müller is the most direct anglicization in this category. The English word for the same occupation, already an established English surname, already common in the American record before the German arrivals. A Müller who became Miller in 1902 left behind a naturalization record that shows both forms. A Müller who had been in the United States since 1848 and whose children were born as Miller in an Indiana county in 1855 left behind almost nothing to indicate the original form. The family appears in the American record as if it had always been Miller, with no visible European counterpart unless the genealogical search reaches back far enough to find the original. Smith. Schmidt and Schmidt are German occupational surnames. Both derive from the same root as the English smith, the metalworker who shapes metal. The German communities that settled in Pennsylvania in the 18th century, the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch, carried Schmidt in large numbers. By the early 19th century, Schmidt families in Lancaster County and Berks County had begun appearing in records as Smith. The process accelerated through the 19th century in communities where English was the dominant language, and where a German surname marked its holder as different in ways that were sometimes economically consequential. By the time the First World War anti-German pressure descended on German-American communities, many Schmidt families had already been Smith for a generation. Their children had no living memory of the German form. Fox. In German and in Yiddish, Fuchs means fox. The Fuchs families who arrived from Austria-Hungary and the German Empire between 1880 and 1920 represent a documented pattern in American genealogical records. Fuchs to Fox is a translation, not a phonetic anglicization. The family did not choose Fox because it approximated the sound of Fuchs. They chose it because the English word and the German word named the same animal. The naturalization records and ship manifests that connect Fuchs in Hamburg or Vienna to Fox in Chicago or Cleveland survive in the National Archives and in the Ellis Island database, searchable today through the platforms that have digitized the immigrant arrival records. For families who carry the name Fox with ancestors from German-speaking communities, the passenger manifests and naturalization petitions are the documents that show the original form and the year the translation was completed. King. König in German means king. The Jewish families named König who arrived in the United States between 1880 and 1924 include a documented subset who became king in the American record. The anglicization follows the same pattern as Stein to stone and Schwartz to black, the English semantic equivalent of the German original. König appeared in the Ashkenazi Jewish naming tradition because European governments, when they required Jewish communities to adopt hereditary surnames in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, assigned some families royal or aristocratic-sounding names, König, Kaiser, Prince, Graf, either as a condition of special permits or because the registrar assigned them without ceremony. A family that carried König from the Pale of Settlement to the port at Hamburg, and then to Ellis Island, and then to a census form in New York in 1910, might appear as king in that census, while the parent's birthplace column still reads Russia, or Poland, or Romania. Fischer. Fischer is the German word for fisherman, an occupational surname common across the German-speaking world and among Jewish communities through both occupational connection and Yiddish naming traditions. Fischer to Fischer is among the most direct transitions in the American record. One letter changed, the umlaut dropped, the meaning preserved. The Fischer families who became Fischer in the American census left a genealogical signature visible in place-of-birth records, in naturalization files, and in ship manifests that show the passenger listed as Fischer and the census entry a decade later as Fischer. Neumann. Neumann in German means new man, a surname common across German-speaking communities, both Jewish and non-Jewish. The Jewish immigrant families named Neumann, who arrived through Ellis Island in the migration years between 1880 and 1924, include a substantial number who became Neumann in American records. The transition is direct, again a translation rather than a phonetic approximation. What the census record shows for these families is the same pattern as the other German to English transitions. Parents born in Germany or Austria or Russia or Poland, children born in Pennsylvania or New York or Ohio, first language Yiddish or German, surname anglicized within the first decade of American residence. Silver. Silber in German and in Yiddish means silver. Silberstein, Silbermann, Silbermann, Silberberg. The silver prefix surnames in the Ashkenazi tradition parallel the gold prefix surnames in origin, in frequency, and in the anglicization pattern that followed immigration. Silverstein families who arrived through Ellis Island between 1880 and 1924 appear in the American census a decade later as Silver, sometimes as Silvers, occasionally as Silverstein, where the family chose partial rather than complete anglicization. The same naturalization files and census records that document the Goldberg to Gold transition document the Silberstein to Silver transition. The document that connects the two forms is the same. The naturalization petition, searchable in federal and state archives, showing the original name in the heading and the requested English form in the petition's body. Burns. The Burns families in the American genealogical record are predominantly of Scottish and Irish origin, from the Old English and Old Norse words for stream. Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, is the most famous bearer of the name, but Burns appears in American records as an anglicization of Bernstein, Burstein, and related Ashkenazi Jewish surnames. The Stein suffix, meaning stone in German and Yiddish, appears in hundreds of Jewish surnames. Bernstein families who became Burns were not making a phonetic approximation. They were finding the nearest available English surname that retained some acoustic connection to the original while erasing its ethnic identification. The naturalization records and school enrollment files that show Bernstein becoming Burns within a single generation are the genealogical evidence that these two surnames, which look entirely different in the American record, describe the same bloodline. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Gold, Goldberg, Goldstein, Goldman, Goldfarb. The gold prefix surnames were among the most common in the Ashkenazi Jewish naming tradition. The assignment of hereditary surnames by European governments in the late 18th and early 19th centuries produced large numbers of gold-based names, partly because the semantic field around gold was prestigious in the German-speaking naming culture, and partly because governments sometimes allowed families to purchase surnames that sounded distinguished. The Goldberg and Goldman families who became Gold in the American record are visible in naturalization files from the 1910s and 1920s. What those files show is the retained prefix of the original name, stripped of the suffix that identified it as German and Jewish, carried forward under a one-syllable form that looks, to any subsequent researcher who does not know to look for the original, like a straightforward Anglo-Saxon name. The mechanism of anglicization was not random. The choice of translation or abbreviation was made by the immigrant family, usually in the first decade of American residence. Sometimes during the naturalization process itself, sometimes through a simple court petition for name change, sometimes through nothing more formal than a decision to begin using the English form on all documents going forward. In the naturalization records and the court petition files that survive in federal and state archives across the northeastern and midwestern United States, the original name appears in the heading and the requested name appears in the petition's body. Those files are the genealogical bridge, connecting the bloodline that arrived from Central and Eastern Europe to the English-sounding surname that shows up in every American record thereafter. The decision was, in some families, made by one person and handed down without explanation. A father who changed the name in 1914 did not always tell his children what the original had been. By the time the grandchildren were old enough to ask, the parent who knew was sometimes gone. The census record from 1920 showed one name. The family Bible, if it survived and if it was consulted, showed another. For many families, the family Bible was not consulted. It was in a language no one in the third generation could read, or it was lost in a move, or it was simply never thought to contain information that mattered. The German-American communities who had arrived in the decades before the First World War faced a different kind of pressure. The anti-German sentiment that built from 1916 and reached its peak in 1917 and 1918 was directed not primarily at Jewish immigrants from German-speaking territories, but at Protestant and Catholic German-American families who had been in the United States for 2 and 3 generations, who had founded churches and newspapers and community organizations across the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic states, who spoke German at home and in their churches and in their German-language schools, and who in 1917 found themselves in a country at war with Germany that had decided, in many communities, that German ancestry was suspect. The Schmidt families, who were not yet Smith, became Smith in 1917 and 1918. The Müller families became Miller. The Zimmermann families became Carpenter in some cases and kept a simplified Zimmermann in others. The Braun families became Brown. The anti-German pressure of the First World War produced a wave of Anglicizations distinct from the gradual assimilation of the decades before and after. It happened fast, under social and sometimes legal pressure, and it was so complete in many communities that the children of families who changed their names in 1917 had no awareness by the 1940s that their surname was anything other than the English form their parents had adopted. The genealogical record of this process survives in court petition files, in church records that span the transition years, in the German-language newspapers that abruptly stopped publishing in 1917 or 1918, in school enrollment records that show a child under one surname in 1916 and a different surname in 1918, and in the family Bibles and letters that some households preserved, and that, when they surfaced in estate sales or archive donations 3 and 4 generations later, showed the original name in handwriting that no one remaining in the family could read: Carpenter. Zimmermann means carpenter in German, an occupational surname common across German-speaking communities. The Zimmermann families who arrived in the large German immigration waves of the 1840s and 1850s, and again in the immigration years from the 1880s through 1924, left genealogical records on both sides of the Anglicization. The ship manifest shows Zimmermann, the naturalization petition shows Carpenter, or the simplified Zimmermann, without the doubled N. The census record in 1920 shows Carpenter, with the parents' birthplace listed as Germany. That document sequence connects the bloodline across the name change: Brown. Braun is the German word for the color brown, a surname appearing in both the Jewish and non-Jewish German-speaking naming traditions. The Braun families who became Brown in American records were making the same semantic translation as the Schwartz families who became black, and the Weiss families who became white. The genealogical evidence for the Braun to Brown transition includes naturalization records, passenger ship manifests, and census records from the first decades after arrival that show a household with German-born parents, American-born children, and a surname that moved from Braun to Brown somewhere between the parents' generation and the children's generation. Tailor. Schneider is the German word for tailor, the person who cuts and sews cloth, and it is among the most common surnames in the German-speaking world. The Schneider families who became Taylor in the American record were making an occupational translation, the same logic that carried Zimmermann to Carpenter and Müller to Miller. Taylor in English names the same profession as Schneider in German. The genealogical trace for Schneider to Taylor transitions is visible in the same document sequence that marks all of these Anglicizations: the European record, the ship manifest, the naturalization file, the census. For families who arrived in the earlier German immigration waves of the 1850s and completed the Anglicization before systematic records were kept, the trace requires working backward from the American census to identify the original name through research in German-speaking country archives. The Italian-American Anglicization pattern follows a different logic. Italian surnames are generally accessible to English speakers in ways that German and Yiddish surnames often are not, which meant that Italian families faced somewhat less pressure to translate their names entirely. What happened instead, in many cases, was truncation and simplification. Di Benedetto became Benedict. Esposito, the most common surname in the city of Naples, given historically to abandoned children registered at the city's foundling hospital, occasionally became Spencer in American records, or sometimes stayed Esposito unchanged. Ferrara became Ferry in some families. The Italian-American genealogical record is, for this reason, more traceable than the German Jewish one. The surname that arrived from Naples or Palermo or Calabria often remained recognizable for 2 or 3 generations before any Anglicization occurred, and when it did occur, the documentary trace in parish records and naturalization files is usually accessible. The Italian-American church registers, maintained by parishes that serve specific immigrant communities in New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston, constitute one of the fullest genealogical records of any Ellis Island-era group, recording baptisms and marriages and deaths under the original surname for as long as the community maintained its own language. Eastern European surnames present a third pattern. Polish, Czech, Slovak, Ukrainian, and Russian surnames are often long, consonant-heavy, and structured according to Slavic linguistic rules that produce letter combinations that English speakers find difficult to process. Wojciechowski, Stankiewicz, Przybyszewski. These names appear on ship manifests in their full original forms. They do not appear in that form in the American census a decade later. What appears in the census is whatever the family, the school teacher, the census enumerator, or the employer was able to write down. Wojciechowski became Voigt, or was reduced to a simplified variant over a single generation. Stankiewicz became Stanley. The simplification was sometimes chosen by the family and sometimes imposed by the surrounding culture's inability to accommodate the original form in everyday record-keeping. The genealogical record of these Eastern European name transitions is preserved in school enrollment documents that often recorded both the family's original surname and the simplified American form used in the classroom. It survives in the records of Eastern Catholic and Roman Catholic parishes that maintained registers in the original languages through the first immigrant generation and then switched to English in the second. It survives in the naturalization petitions that show the original name in the heading and the court's acceptance of a simplified form in the conclusion of the petition. The Irish-American surname record tells a different story about timing. By the time Irish immigrants began arriving in large numbers through Castle Garden and later through Ellis Island, many Gaelic surnames had already been anglicized for 2 and sometimes 3 generations under English colonial administration. The Gaelic O prefix, meaning grandson or descendant, and the Mac prefix, meaning son of, had been systematically stripped from Irish surnames beginning in the 16th and 17th centuries. O'Brien, in its original form, became O'Brien, and then for many families who arrived on the East Coast during the famine emigration of the 1840s and 1850s, became Brian with no prefix at all. O'Murchada, which means sea warrior, had become Murphy in English long before any family bearing it crossed the Atlantic. The dropping of the O and the Mac from Irish surnames was not always a single moment of Ellis Island-era decision. It was an erasure that had begun in Ireland itself, under colonial pressure, and that continued across the Atlantic whenever the family saw practical advantage in presenting a name that looked simply English rather than unmistakably Irish. A Sullivan in an American census is almost certainly an O'Sullivan whose family had already been through the first stage of the change before they boarded the ship. What the DNA now shows across all of these name transition groups is the ancestral signature that the name change was designed to conceal or simplify away. A family named Stone that takes a commercial DNA test and receives a result showing 40 to 60% Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, with no Jewish surnames visible in the family tree going back 3 generations, is a family carrying a Stein or Steinberg or Steiner line that completed the English translation sometime in the 1910s or 1920s. The DNA returned what the name change erased. The genome does not know what name the family chose to use on the census form. It carries the population signal regardless of what the petition filed in a county courthouse decided to call the family going forward. The Ashkenazi Jewish reference population is particularly well defined in commercial testing platforms because the Ashkenazi community shows a pattern of shared ancestry traceable to a founding population in medieval Europe and a subsequent history of limited intermarriage with surrounding communities. That pattern makes Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry among the most accurately identified results in any commercial DNA test. A result showing 15 or 20% Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry indicates a line that entered the family tree at a calculable number of generations back, from a specific person who made the decision to change a name that the DNA did not change with it. The ship manifests from the Ellis Island era are searchable through the Ellis Island Foundation database at libertyellisfoundation.org and through Ancestry and Family Search. The search fields allow entry by the original surname in its European form. A search for Stein in the passenger records from 1890 to 1924 returns thousands of entries. A search for those same families in the American Census from 1900 to 1940 returns them as Stone. The bridge between the two records is the Naturalization file, held at the National Archives, in federal court records, and in state court archives across the northeastern and midwestern states, where the majority of Ellis Island arrivals settled. Many have been digitized and indexed. The index is searchable by the original name. The file itself, when found, shows both the original and the new name, the date of the change, and the county in which the petition was filed. For families who want to trace the original surname, the document sequence is specific. Begin with the DNA result, which identifies the ancestral population. Search the census records backward from the earliest known American generation, looking for the parents' and grandparents' birthplace columns. Search the passenger records for arrivals from that country of origin in the approximate period of immigration. Then search the naturalization records for a petition that shows both the original and anglicized forms. That sequence, followed carefully, recovers what the name change left behind. Stone carries Stein inside it. Black carries Schwartz. White carries Weiss, Müller carries Müller, and Smith carries Schmidt. What appears in the American record as Fox was Fuchs in the original European form. Koenig became King, Fisher became Fisher, Neumann became Newman, Silberstein became Silver. The Bernstein families who became Burns, the Goldberg and Goldman and Goldstein families who became Gold, the Zimmermann families who became Carpenter, the Braun families who became Brown, the Schneider families who became Taylor. These are the names that hundreds of thousands of families adopted in 1 or 2 generations to carry the bloodline forward under a different visible identity. The records that document the transition were not destroyed. They were filed in court archives and in naturalization offices and in the ship manifest databases, and they are still there, waiting for the researcher who knows to look for both names at once. The gap between what the ship manifest shows and what the census reads is not an oversight in the historical record. It is the historical record. It is the trace of a decision made under pressure, and a family that follows it finds the decision itself, the petition, the county, the year, the name before and the name after. What survives in the genealogical record is the gap between the name on the ship manifest and the name on the first American census. That gap is not empty. It holds the year the family arrived, the court where the petition was filed, the original surname in its European form, and the new surname chosen to move the bloodline forward. The DNA cannot tell you which specific person in your tree made the change or what the original looked like on the page. That work belongs to the documents. But the DNA identifies the question, and the question is worth asking. If your result returns a population that does not match the name you carry, the ship manifests are free to search tonight. The naturalization records are digitized and indexed. The family story was not wrong, it was edited. The records hold the version before the edit, in the same archives where the new name was first written down, filed beside the old one, waiting. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.